Listen for the word of the Lord. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? It was not because of his sins or his parents' sins, Jesus answered. This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. We must quickly carry out the tasks assigned us by the one who sent us. The night is coming, and then no one can work. But while I am here in the world, I am the light of the world. Then he spit on the ground, made mud from the saliva, and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. He told him, go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. Siloam means sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. His neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar asked each other, isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? Some said he was, and others said, no, he just looks like him. But the beggar kept saying, yes, I am the same man. They asked, who healed you? What happened? He told them, the man they called Jesus made mud and spread it over my eyes and told me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So I went and washed, and now I can see. Where is he now? They asked. I don't know, he replied. Then they took the man who had been blind to the Pharisees because it was on the Sabbath that Jesus had made the mud and healed him. The Pharisees asked the man all about it. So he told them, he put the mud over my eyes, and when I washed it away, I could see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man Jesus is not from God, for he is working on the Sabbath. Others said, but how could an ordinary sinner do such miraculous signs? So there was a deep division of opinion among them. Then the Pharisees again questioned the man who had been blind and demanded, what's your opinion about this man who healed you? The man replied, I think he must be a prophet. The Jewish leaders still refused to believe the man had been blind and could now see, so they called in his parents. They asked them, is this your son? Was he born blind? If so, how can he now see? His parents replied, we know this is our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can see or who healed him. Ask him. He is old enough to speak for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had announced that anyone saying Jesus was the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. That's why they said, he is old enough, ask him. So for the second time, they called in the man who had been blind and told him, God should get the glory for this because we know this man Jesus is a sinner. The man said, I don't know whether he's a sinner, but I know this. I was blind, and now I see. But what did he do? They asked. How did he heal you? Look, the man exclaimed, I told you once. Didn't you listen? Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Then they cursed him and said, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses, but we don't even know where this man comes from. Why, that's very strange, the man replied. He healed my eyes, and yet you don't know where he comes from? We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he is ready to hear those who worship him and do his will. Ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't have done it. You were born a total sinner, they answered. Are you trying to teach us? And they threw him out of the synagogue. When Jesus heard what had happened, he found the man and asked, do you believe in the Son of Man? The man answered, who is he, sir? I want to believe in him. You have seen him, Jesus said, and he is speaking to you. Yes, Lord, I believe, the man said, and he worshiped Jesus. Then Jesus told him, I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see that they are blind. Some Pharisees who were standing nearby heard him and asked, are you saying we're blind? If you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty, Jesus replied, but you remain guilty because you claim you can see. Friends, this is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. One of my favorite weeks of the year is the week right before daylight saving time. I get up usually without the alarm clock. It's not pitch black when Terry and I go walk. I have finally got into my set natural realm of time. It's like my body goes, finally, and I get it for 1 week. And then it's like the old Simon and Garfunkel song, hello, darkness, my old friend. I don't spring forward well. I don't like the darkness. Granted, I like that it's light later on in the day, but it is so dark in the morning now. Imagine never having seen. When people talk about colors, blue, purple, yellow, you have no idea what that looks like. Imagine in a time where seeing is everything and that people assume, there's that word, assume that if you are blind from birth, then there is sin involved. It's either yours or your parents. Imagine that you had to beg for your living because you're blind. There's no blind or academies or Braille. There's nobody really to even help you unless you just happen upon a kind person. Because again, they think that you're blind because of sin. You deserve it. And if it wasn't anything you did, well, it was your parents. Well, we understand that, don't we? First thing around in small towns is, now who's your parents? That's how we find out how people are, right? Is who their parents are. And if we had run-ins with their parents when we were in school, or if they were troublemakers in school, what do we immediately think? Well, their children can't be any good. We assume, don't we? We make assumptions all the time. This passage is more than just Jesus healing a blind man from birth. It's about the assumptions that his own disciples make and that the Jewish leaders make about this man. Imagine living a life of blindness, trying to just get enough money to eat, to exist. I'm sure he was used to all the terrible things that people said about him. I mean, here it is. The disciples come and say, who sinned, this man or his parents? Now, I hope that most of you at some point in your life have encountered a person blind, whether it's from birth or due to an ailment. But what usually happens if one thing is diminished, your sight or your hearing, the other sense gets better, doesn't it? If you can't see, your hearing gets really good because that's how you orient yourself. That's how you're able to find out who's around you since you can't see someone coming. Well, imagine how good this man's hearing had to have been. So he heard the disciples say, hey, Jesus, what about this man here? This sinner over here. Hey, this man's a sinner right here, or his parents are. They thought nothing of saying that in front of the man where he could hear it. So I'm sure in his mind he's thinking, well, here we go again. And Jesus says something that the blind man hadn't probably ever heard before. Normally he would have heard, well, of course, if he was born blind, it couldn't have been his sin. It had to have been his parents' sin. This man may have loved his parents dearly and that they had done everything they could for him. And he knew that they had done nothing wrong to cause his blindness. But he had to hear that every day by people who didn't even know him and who assumed. Instead, from Jesus, he hears something different. Neither. And they're like, well, wait a minute, it's got to be one or the other. No, it doesn't. It is so that the glory of God can be shown. Now, I'm sure that one of the things, besides hearing all this from passersby, this blind man had to endure was people spitting on him. You know, you see the old Jewish ladies in movies where something's bad or make sure they're not cursed. You know, we would throw salt over our shoulder if we spilled salt. Excuse me. But the Jewish ladies would spit, you know, across, don't want to be cursed. They thought this man was cursed. So, of course, if they happened to believe that any contact with him would curse them also, they would spit on him, near him. So when this blind man all of a sudden hears Jesus start to hawk up a spit, he's expecting the worst of what he's had all his life. Instead, he doesn't feel anything on his face. He hears the man doing something in the dirt, and the next thing he feels is that mud, that soft touch of Jesus covering his eyes. Now imagine, I'm sure he's thinking, well, this is different. So he does exactly what the man says, thinking, well, it can't hurt. I really don't see how this is going to help, but I'll go wash in the pool of Siloam. And bingo, bango, miracle on the Sabbath. And what do the blind Jewish leaders see? They see that somebody who does something against God's law, the law of Moses, by healing on the Sabbath can't be from God. Now, where is our darkness? Where do we see that, oh, somebody who has, fill in your prejudice and assumption blank. Somebody who has piercings everywhere and wears black all the time and curses. They can't love God. Somebody who never steps foot in a church, they can't love God. Somebody who heals on the Sabbath, they can't love God. Somebody goes to the movies on Sabbath, they can't love God. That can't be from God, that person. We make assumptions in our blinders, in our darkness. The blind man had true physical darkness. The Jewish leaders had darkness of not seeing that the Messiah was here to do a new thing, to explain to them the law that they had been given through Moses was one of love, of being disciplined by God and loving God with all their heart and loving others instead of a list of rules to follow. We get bogged down in the rules. But let's face it, we all like to have boundaries, don't we? A set of rules that gives us comfort. When you play a game, if everybody played Shanghai by their own rules, it wouldn't be any fun. Everybody just make up their own rules. But God is showing us through Jesus's healing of the blind man, which, by the way, this is the longest passage in the gospel where Jesus is out of the picture. It's the longest passage. They wanted us to see what the blind man's parents thought, how the blind man responded, how the Jewish leaders kept trying to what? Blame it on somebody. And isn't that what we do with our own sin? We need to blame it on somebody. Well, he's standing on the corner with his dog and his sign that says, need food, because he's not willing to work. We assume, don't we? If he's really hungry, well, that dog takes a lot of money. He has to feed that dog. We assume so much in our blindness, in our darkness. We assume that God has abandoned us when it's our own darkness. We assume that God has abandoned that person because they don't fit into our model of what a right living person looks like. There was a man that, as he graduated high school, he went to college and he had such big plans. He had planned on being a lawyer. And Sandy, I'm trying to think what college he was at. Sandy was at Columbia University. And after starting college, he experienced problems with his eyes. Well, they had diagnosed it as conjunctivitis. But his vision kept getting more and more blurry. The doctors finally diagnosed his ailment as severe glaucoma, and it was rapidly destroying his optic nerve. Well, now this was in the early 60s. He knew that he would eventually be completely blind and that all of his dreams had been dashed. He left school, went home to try to find out what menial job he could learn to do now that he was blind. Well, his friend from college decided he was going to get on a plane and fly to his hometown. And he said, Sandy, I don't care if you're blind. You're coming back to school, and I'm going to help you graduate. Whatever it takes, I'll be there. Well, it took a little while for him to convince him, but he did and then eventually convince him to come back to school. And with his friend's help, he made it through classes. He graduated. Instead of becoming a lawyer, he started his own company and made millions. He had dreams beyond what his blindness tried to teach him in the beginning, that now that you're blind, you can't accomplish anything. And his friend had a funny way of helping him. He would walk in a room and he would call himself darkness. His friend would come in and say, darkness is going to read to you now. Darkness is here, ready to help you study now. Until one day he took him to Grand Central Station. And his friend had always been right by his side, helping him maneuver whatever he needed to maneuver. And in Grand Central Station in New York, his friend left him. He'd never been left alone before. His friend or another friend had always been there. He was terrified. Grand Central Station, New York City, no sight. Well, he stumbled through. He finally made his way to get on the bus, got to the stop outside of his apartment, got off, felt his way with his cane to the door, and right in front of his apartment door. A man runs into him and says, "Oh, excuse me." And he hears the voice of his friend. He'd been with him all the time. He'd never left his side. He just remained quiet, making sure that he was okay, that Sandy could maneuver this world without him and have the confidence that he knew he had. He just had to prove it to himself. It wasn't long before that friend called him and said, "I need some money. I need $400. My friend and I are going to make an album, and we need $400 to get our first album produced." He and his wife, who had also helped him through college, had $405 in the bank. He didn't hesitate. He gave all $400, left them $5, and gave it to his friend who had helped him. That $400 allowed Art Garfunkel and Paul Simon to create their first album. And the song on that album was "The Sounds of Silence." Now, the interesting part of that "Hello Darkness, My Old Friend" is it had nothing to do with Art Garfunkel and his friend Sandy. Paul had his own darkness, and that's just it. We all have our own darkness, whether it's assumptions that we have, whether it's a time of grief or a time of pain and suffering. We all assume that somebody else's darkness might be caused by their own bad choices or our own bad choices. But the darkness within us can only be healed by the light of Christ. Maybe that's why this passage in John is the longest passage of all the background of what went on during this healing of a miracle. Man born blind. All I know is I once was blind, but now I see. So maybe the next time that we make assumptions, the next time we feel that God has left us and we are struggling to find our way in this world, maybe it's God right there saying, "Here I am. I'm here in the darkness. I'm your friend, and I'm not ever leaving you. Let's go through this life together. Don't worry. I'll light the way." Amen.